Hi, everybody. With our Happy Mind Story series, I share the inspirational stories of people who have suffered with mental illness or mental health issues and have successfully learned to live with this and go on to thrive, and are now helping others to do the same. In today's Happy Mind Story, I have the pleasure of speaking with Michelle Rosenthal. Michelle is an award-winning trauma PTSD blogger, award-nominated author and keynote speaker, workshop and seminar leader and mentor, and a trauma recovery specialist and mental health advocate. She's appeared frequently in the media for many years and has been a top health blogger for stress management community on wellsphere.com, the founder of Trauma, a PTS blog on healthyplace.com, and frequent contributor to anxiety.org and numerous other publications. She is a certified professional coach, board certified trauma and PTS hypnotist, and licensed master practitioner of neuro-linguistic programming. She's also the author of 3 books: Before the World Intruded, Conquering the Past and Creating the Future, Your Life After Trauma, Powerful Practices for Reclaiming Identity and Heal Your PTSD, Dynamic Strategies that Work. She's also a trauma and PTS sufferer or survivor. She's a survivor now and thriver herself, and affectionately refers to her recovery as a healing rampage. Her passion is to inspire and assist action-oriented people who are ready to overcome the effects of trauma, including fear, grief, guilt, shame, loss, and a whole range of emotions. So, Michelle, thank you so much for taking part in the Happy Minds Summit and sharing your Happy Minds story. So how are you going today?
Damien, thank you so much. I'm doing great, coming to you from sunny Southeast Florida. I'm about 2 hours south of Disney World on the water. So the ocean is just a mile or two away. And I'm so pleased. I love this project that you have going, and I'm just delighted to be a part of it. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, let's get started, and perhaps you could talk a little bit about yourself and your story and what kind of like has taken you on this journey to where you are now.
Well, you said earlier I was a trauma and PTS sufferer, and that is true. I know that you changed it to survivor, which is also true, but the story, of course, for all of us begins with our suffering. So I was a 13-year-old kid, had a massive, massive medical trauma, and I don't usually go into details. I don't like to trigger anybody. The details are out there on my website and other places. But let's just say that by the time I was in a quarantined hospital room for several weeks, and by the time I got out, I was very aware that I was not the same girl that had gone into the hospital. But I didn't really know what that meant. It was 1981, and nobody was looking at civilian kids with medical trauma as PTS candidates. So I just got labeled a difficult teen, and then later a temperamental artist, because I'm a writer, and that was my profession. And so there were always excuses or justifications for my behavior. But I can tell you, from the time I was 13, and the symptoms started pretty early on: insomnia, anxiety, dramatic mood swings, deep depression, rage episodes, and a complete inability to talk about what had happened to me. And I remember thinking, if I have to talk about this, I'm going to go like certifiably crazy. I can't handle the feelings that go along with the words that describe what I just survived. And I also had a near-death experience. The mortality rate for what was wrong was very high. I had a near-death experience, and I didn't have a way of integrating what that meant. I didn't have anybody to talk to me. Spirituality was not a discussion in the early 1980s. And there was no Google. So it's not like I could find other people that I could say, hey, this happened to me. So I just sort of tried to, I thought the courageous thing to do would be to hide all of my symptoms and pretend that everything was okay. And I was very successful at doing that. Unless you actually really knew me. Like, my mom was very aware something was not okay. But every time she tried an intervention, and she would drag me to therapists and psychiatrists and all this, I simply wouldn't talk about it. And it just exacerbated my rage. So she eventually let go. And I grew into this exorbitant PTS experience that lasted for almost 3 decades, until things got so bad that I finally got into therapy. So that's the short version of, what trauma just distorts us, doesn't it? And it creates lies that you tell yourself, that then you live those lies and you think they're truths because it's the only way you can understand what you've survived. And then we take that meaning and that understanding and we create a life on it. And there is no way to create a healthy mind or a healthy life out of the lies and distortions that trauma cloaks us in. So
No,
it gets
definitely.
tricky.
Well, thank you so much for being so vulnerable and sharing that story. So, a question that comes to mind for me is, how come it took you 3 decades? Like, remember, this is not me a judging kind of question. It's
No,
because I can even look at myself and I go, I also, well, actually, I haven't even done anything about what I've kind of experienced. So I also would go, like, throughout my childhood, reflection, it set me up to not be the person I could have been if I had dealt with these kind of things. So why did it take yourself personally 30 years to be able to kind of like finally be able to resolve your situation?
that's a great question. Some of it was cultural, some of it was timing, some of it was personal perspective. So let's take them piece by piece. So culturally, 1981, nobody, like, PTS was only being, and it was PTSD back then, it was only being applied to Vietnam veterans. So nobody would have looked at me and said, she had a trauma. And here, we're out of the 30 days of acute stress, and now we're into the beyond 30 days of these categories of symptoms. And, here's what it is. Nobody said that ever, ever. And I remember, and I developed a full-blown eating disorder. So I was 5'8", I was 100 pounds, I was like, things were bad. And I remember my mother taking me to eating disorder specialists, and nobody ever said to me, do you have trauma in your background? What's this eating disorder doing for you? Everybody said to me, you have body image issues. And I would say to them, I really don't have body image issues. I don't care about this body. And it never tipped somebody off. Well, let's talk about that. Why don't you care about this body? So partly it was cultural. There was no PTSD in the civilian world, and partly it was conventional therapeutic interventions were very like, if you're not the square peg, we don't know what to do with you. You have to fit into this model of what an eating disorder is about. But, we know now eating disorders are about control. And there's nothing that's hard to understand about a trauma survivor trying to be in control, because the effects of trauma are all about being helpless and powerless. And we all are looking for a way to be more in control. So partly it's that the professional help wasn't there for me. And the other part, Damien, was that I was hiding my pain. I was hiding my suffering. I literally, this is interesting. I had a conversation with a friend after my first book came out. So my first book came out in 2012, and she's been friends with me since I was 3. So way before my trauma and through my trauma. So my book came out, I was in my 40s, and she read it and she called me crying and she said, how did I not know any of this? She said, I've been your best friend since we were 3. How did I not know you were suffering so much? And I said, because I didn't tell anybody. I didn't show anybody. I had a mask. I played a role. I was the happiest person at the party, but not inside, you know? So when you live a life that's not authentic, it's very easy to go 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. You're not getting the intervention help that you need. You're not being honest with yourself. And to add to all of that, I justified it. I justified the way that I was living by saying some people are meant to be crazy. Like literally in this world, people are crazy. And all of the behaviors that I had that added up to my definition of crazy, I thought, well, I'm also an artist, and like some of the best artists are crazy. So let's just be as good crazy as you can be, Michelle. Just be as good crazy as you can be. So I stopped thinking there was a way out, and I just lived more in. And then another decade goes by. So it wasn't until, I used to have a podcast, and I interviewed a neuroscientist on my podcast, and a neuropsychologist. And he said to me something I'll never forget. He said, the mind is capable of producing 50% more stress than the body can handle. I never knew that, but it explained how I finally got into therapy, because my body started breaking down. My liver, and I'm not a substance abuser. I don't drink, but my liver enzymes were off the charts. My stomach was a mess. My gut was a mess. My hair was falling out. Like my body was a disaster. And all the specialists in Manhattan, which is where I was living at the time, could not help me. And I was terrified that I was going to die and nobody could help me. And that got me into therapy. I didn't get into therapy for trauma. I got into therapy because I was terrified I was going to die because nobody could help me. And I needed to learn how to live with that. And that is what finally got me on the road to recovery. And it took me another decade to actually heal. But does that answer your question? It's like all of these other factors come into play. And the next thing you know, 3 decades have gone by, and a third of your life is gone because you didn't actually get the help that was out there. It just hadn't been developed enough or offered to you in a way that you could relate to it.
No, it does answer the question. And then the reason I asked the question is because I think there are many people our generation who may have experienced something in their youth or even earlier in life and then realize that it had an impact on them. And they have unexplained kind of symptoms and ways of living, behaviors, perhaps like you talked about aggression. They can't explain why they fly off the handle for no reason, why they have kind of strange emotions, like for no reason they feel sad or they're extremely emotional for certain things. So there are a whole lot of unexplained kind of like things, and they just kind of like relegated it to the explanation that I am just different. This is who I am. And, it's just who I am. So basically, I can't change it. I can't fix it because there's nothing to fix because I've always been like this. So as you said, you just numb yourself to a particular point and then you don't really realize that, in fact, something is amiss and needs to be addressed. So, so like basically you went to therapy for completely what you thought was unrelated, and it's through that experience you kind of identified that you did have PTSD and trauma and unresolved issues as a result.
But not, those two things were not related, sadly enough. I went in, this is the late 90s by the time I actually went into therapy. For 17 years after my trauma, I couldn't talk about what had happened. And then when I got into therapy, it was to learn how to live, oddly enough, with a trauma that I was experiencing in the moment, right? Like I'm terrified I'm going to die because I'm really medically ill and nobody can help me. And the funny thing was, I was in talk therapy for 5 years. And by the end of the 5 years, I was markedly worse than I was at the beginning. And things were pretty bad at the beginning. And all we did was two things. Number one, we talked around and around and around about I don't like nothing that relieved me or released me. We did do some energy work. I like to say in my recovery, I did the alphabet. So we did EMDR, EFT, TFT, TAT. Like we did all CBT. We did all of the alphabetical things. And that was useful. But by the end of 5 years, I was really like, however bad my body had been before, it was like now I couldn't work. I was like, it was things were, and mentally I was in a much worse place because now after 5 years of talk therapy, I'm fully activated, right? Now, instead of wearing the mask, I've taken off the mask, but I have no resolution for all the trauma that I'm carrying. And now we're just talking about it all the time, which you and I know now in 2023, it's like the worst way you could spend 5 years from a neurological perspective. You're strengthening all those neural pathways. But in 2003, that wasn't what everybody was saying. And so things were really, really bad. And I realized I have to get out of New York City. I'm never going to be able to heal in New York City. This is where my trauma happened. This lifestyle doesn't allow me to heal. And I thought, if I can just get to a beach, I think I could sort things through. And I didn't even know what that meant, Damien. I just knew I needed to get to a beach. So I convinced my family to move, my parents and my brother. I convinced everybody to move. And we came down to Florida and I got to a beach. And after sitting on the beach for a couple of months, I got to a library and I said, okay, I have to figure this out because nobody's helping me. And I started research and I started researching the medical trauma. And that led me to research on trauma psychology. And I read everything from the 1880s in France when it started all the way through Bessel van der Kolk today. And I started to understand, oh, like this is deep trauma stuff. This isn't like, let's just talk about it stuff. This is like in my cells. And that was interesting. And it led me to research on dissociation. And suddenly I understood. I used to tell my therapist all the time, you see me here, like you see me in this body, but I'm actually like 3 feet to the right. Like I am actually 3 feet to the right. That's classic dissociation and, depersonalization, but he never taught me any of that. He just thought it was interesting, but he never normalized what I was going through. So I took it as more evidence I was crazy. And when I started reading the research, dissociation, okay, now I get it. This is me. And that dissociation research led me to post-traumatic stress disorder. I'd never heard of it before. And there was a 22 question self-test. I mean, I think it's still out there. It's based on the DSM-5 now criteria. And out of the 22 questions, I answered affirmatively to 20 of them. Now, you can't self-diagnose, obviously, off some quiz on the internet. So I printed it out. I took it to my next therapy session. And I said to my therapist, look at this, do you think I have PTSD? Do you think that's the problem beneath everything? And Damien, I kid you not, there was a pause. And then he said to me, what is PTSD? And I thought, oh my God, I've been in therapy for 5 years with a man who fundamentally does not understand trauma at all. Like he's great at the energy therapies, but like I'm not getting resolution because he doesn't really understand what's wrong. And so that was when I discovered there's such a thing as a trauma therapist, like a trauma-informed person. And I hightailed it to somebody locally who that was her sole focus, got my diagnosis. And that was the beginning of the end of PTSD for me, because with a name, I understood the problem was not me. I was not crazy. And there was something to do about it that was specific. And so that was very exciting. And I think it's those kind of moments that lead us forward and help us kind of burst out, because you actually, two things happen there. Number one, I took responsibility for my own recovery, which I had never done, because you're kind of passive. You're like overwhelmed with symptoms, right? And the other thing was that I understood the problem wasn't me. And that really helped, knowing that the problem was not me. Was very liberating, because then I could sort of see it as, okay, there's some other thing that I just have to figure out how to tame this. And then I could potentially be free. And so those were two big turning points. I know that's not what you asked, but that's kind of where I've gotten to. So I hope that's okay.
No, it's perfect. So I do have a question around labeling what you have. Like I understand in your situation, because you kind of like actually saw it as, it's not me, it's something else, and then I've got a label now. I understand it, so now I can address it. But isn't there also, like, in my case, if someone came to me and said you've got PTSD, I would like almost take it on as an identity, and then I don't want to know the identity. I want to like go, okay, there's some kind of like issue and all these kind of symptoms, and I want to kind of like deal with those symptoms. So is there, depending on your personality, a chance that, some people might go, oh, look, I've got it, I'm the victim. Like, obviously this is not you, you're the one who goes, now I know what it is, now I'm going to like take control. And you seem very empowered and kind of like responsible person. But isn't there also a danger someone that assumes, oh, I'm the victim, I've got this, and then now I've got this identity and I am that person as well? Like, I don't know, like I'm just kind of like curious.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point. So let's start with, I think you're right. I think everybody has that option. It's a choice. And if you want to back it up, we're all living that identity, to be honest, whether there's a label or not. We're all living the PTSD identity to begin with, because it's an identity of powerlessness. It's an identity of feeling out of control of your own mind, your own body, your own world, your own life. So we're all already living that. I respect everybody who doesn't like having a label. I get it. To each his own. I respect everybody who wants to drop the D. I personally love the D. That D meant everything to me. It wasn't just stress. Everybody has stress. No, the D was a disorder, not a disease. A disease cannot be cured. A disorder is simply a misalignment to me, and a disorder can be cured. And we're not supposed to use that word, but I like it. I like healed. Everybody's different, but I found it incredibly liberating. So I would say everybody has their own approach, right, to how they want to engage with language. At the end of the day, it's really just language. At the end of the day, the real question is, are you or are you not taking responsibility for where you go from this moment forward? And if it feels better to like smack that label down and not take it on because you feel more empowered that way, awesome. For me, I loved that label. In my head, it was big neon bright lights, and I could decide how to pull the plug. It was mine. Finally, it was mine, because the problem wasn't me. And I had spent so many years thinking the problem was me. And so I think you're asking a really fair question. And I do think it's individual. But I'm not sure it matters, because I think whether you take on the label or not, you're living the identity. And the question is, what are you going to do about it?
No, very true. So, so how did you learn to kind of like deal with it from there? So now you've got that mark in the sand, which kind of like identified for you, there is an explanation for all the things I've experienced up to this particular point in time. So how did you then kind of like move forward and kind of like begin the process of healing?
So the first thing I did was stop therapy 100% altogether, which I don't recommend for everybody. But after 5 years, over 5 years of talking, I was sick of talking. I just was sick of it. And from all of my research, I kind of started to formulate my own ideas from all the research combined with my experience. And what I decided was there were really two problems. And this is how I work with all my clients now. Because back then, inside my own process, I realized there were two problems. Number one, I had a trauma addiction. I constantly was putting myself in dangerous situations because, in a warped way, I felt safe, more alive when I was doing that. And I knew that I was constantly going back in my head to like review my trauma and think about it and see myself through the lens of trauma. So that's another form of trauma addiction to me. So I knew that I had to heal the trauma addiction. And then the flip side of it was I had an extreme identity crisis. I could not see myself as anyone other than this powerless survivor. And it was really clear to me that if I was going to live the life I was meant to be living, I would have to live it in the absence of a trauma addiction and in the fullness of a true, authentic identity that was empowered and full of a life force that was truly mine. So that is how I moved forward. I went on a quest to do those two things. And so I did them in two different ways. Number one, I literally launched a joy quest because in order to connect with my true self, I had to connect with something that felt good about being me. And I was emotionally numb. So it like I was full of despair. It never occurred to me I could actually feel joy. It was just I felt like it was just practical. I'm full of despair. What's the opposite of that? Joy. Okay, how do we do that? So that was trial and error, and I had to figure it out. And then the other side was I was looking for some kind of therapeutic intervention that would allow me to stop talking about it, but would be effective, and that would address the addictive nature of traumatic memory. And again, this is like early 2000s. We didn't have all the neuroscience that we have now that would allow me to know like why that was the right thing to do. It just intuitively seemed practical. And I happened to be driving in the car one day, and an ad came on the radio, how hypnosis can cure a nicotine addiction. And I thought, a nicotine addiction is pretty compelling. Like, that's chemical in the body. I didn't know at that time that PTSD is chemical too, but in its own way. But I just thought, if you can cure a nicotine addiction with hypnosis, seems like trauma would fall inside the scope of that practice. And so I started down the path of hypnosis. And ultimately, it was a combination of really great coaching, hypnosis, and neurolinguistic programming, those two latter ones that really address the unconscious neurological structures of trauma without talking it to death, that freed me. So you can imagine my surprise after almost 30 years to be completely free was mind-blowing and extraordinary and really exciting.
So how long did this process kind of like take you before you felt that you were on the other side of it all?
So my whole, like, if you took it from, I started talk therapy the first time in 1998, and I finished my last hypnosis session in 2007. So the whole process took me 9 years. But from the time I moved to Florida and took responsibility for my recovery and did all that research, took me 2 years. And that's not to say that the 5 years that came before weren't effective. I did a lot of, like, I came to understand that healing is cumulative. Even when you think something's a fail, like I was not a good candidate for EMDR. I did a 3 sessions, and it threw me into such a dark depression. I was afraid I would never come out. So it's not that everything worked that I did, but I do recognize that everything is like a deposit you put in your healing bank account. And I think what really accelerated those last 2 years was that I took responsibility and I got out of conventional approaches and went more into the body and the unconscious. And I really believe those are the 3 things, or the 2 things, that I took responsibility and then I went the alternative route that led me into the body and the unconscious. because we don't realize, your your conscious mind, as you probably know, is like 12 to 15% of your brain. The rest is unconscious. So if you're just doing cognitive approaches, you're failing to address the 85 to 87% of your brain that is really the source of your problem. And if you're not addressing the body, your cells hold memory. If you're not addressing the memories that your cells are holding, we're they're going to carry it forever. So you really have to, it has to be a holistically integrated approach, in my opinion, to really get to the end. But to wrap up the answer to your question, those final 2 years, Damien, were not a straight line. Let's be honest, because it's hard work, and I got completely overwhelmed. And the more deep I went into it, I started writing my first book at that time because I thought maybe I could write my way through it and be done with it. And that just exacerbated all of my symptoms. So then I had to put the book down, and I had to put my therapeutic approach down and just sort of sit on the beach for a couple of months and try to re-regulate myself. So it stops and starts, but 2 years of stops and starts led me to the end finally.
Very good. So what was the body-oriented kind of work you did?
Well, I wish I could tell you it was something that everybody could do, like somatic experiencing, something that has a real professional approach. But for me, the somatic aspect of things, I don't like to be touched. So, and that was an outgrowth of my trauma. So I was not a good candidate for like craniosacral or massage or somatic experiencing for that, any of that stuff. What I ended up doing, my joy quest led me to dance. And dance is a very somatic process. So instead of constantly feeling like I was outside my body, dance led me back into my body. And when I dance, I feel transcendent. Like I can't, it's even hard to find the words. I've been a dancer now for so long, but it's still hard to find the words. Somehow I can transcend everything and get to this place of joy, which is like this incredible neurotransmitter cascade of the best neurotransmitters ever. And that sensation of feeling safe in my body, but not just safe, present in my body, but not just present, happy in my body, but not even just happy in my body, alive with pleasure in my body. Well, that rewrote the history of my body and my relationship to my body. And it was phenomenal. So, there are great somatic approaches that you can have a practitioner lead you through. But I think even for people who can't afford it or they don't want to do that, I think there are other somatic experiences that you can create for yourself that create such a transformative experience that your body releases things and that your mind changes in relationship to your body. And when I say I danced, I literally mean I signed up for a dance class every day of the week. So that was like 1 to 2 hours every single day. And then 3 nights a week, I went dancing all night. So I'm a bit of an overachiever. So it was like, if we're going to do this joy thing, we're going all the way. So it was an immensely healing approach for me.
Very good. Yeah, no, it's an important point. You got to find something that resonates with you. I mean, when you get things that are prescriptive, I think you kind of like, if you're a person who has been desensitized and then certain things kind of like triggered them, and then being forced to go down a particular path, it just heightens your hypersensitivity. So I think it's
Yeah.
better to kind of like work out what kind of like you're drawn to, and then something that gets you, into your body, as you said. I think that's a more healing kind of like approach rather than like, paint by the numbers. This is what you need to do.
Exactly. And it's one of the reasons why with all the clients that I work with that are open to going on a joy quest when it's appropriate in their process, I tell them, It's not dance. For me, it was dance. What is it for you? What's the physical thing that you love to do that makes you feel transcendent? So I have one local client, it's being out on the water. You know, it's getting on his wave runner and just going for an hour or two out onto the ocean. I have another who it's horses, and it's just like getting on her horse and just riding across the meadows until she's just exhausted by it. You know, it's everybody finds their different physical connection to what feels good, and it's not like you don't find it right away necessarily. Some people may know. I didn't know. It's not like I woke up one day and I was like, oh, let's dance. It happened by accident. I ended up at a New Year's Eve party dancing on a night that I wanted to kill myself. And the disparity between how I felt when I was dancing versus how I felt crying in the bathroom stall like 5 minutes before was so stark that it made me pay attention. And I realized, oh, there's something here. There, like this that I feel on a dance floor. I can do something. This is important. This means something. So sometimes you might know off the top of your head, but sometimes you might just have to be aware when you're out and living, oh, this feels good. And that, you know, I teach everybody, it's like the better you feel, the more you heal. So you have to follow the good energy, as tiny as it may be. It may be just like a tiny star in the darkest night. Well, follow it, because that little light is there for a reason, and you can leverage it to your benefit.
No, definitely. I like that. I think the message there is that you do need to tune in. You need to become aware of
Mm.
how you're feeling, and then be open to feeling, and then that will inevitably kind of like direct you on what you need to do. I think so many of us kind of live quite disembodied. We don't really kind of
Yeah.
like want to kind of feel and want to kind of like, or spend the time. We get so busy, caught up, that we don't actually spend time to kind of work out what actually lights us on fire. And, that's the secret, isn't it? Find what lights you on fire and then follow that. And then that's a good way to keep yourself kind of grounded as opposed to just getting busy doing stuff.
That's so true. And you referenced earlier, for people who've struggled or suffered for a really long time, it might seem to you like, well, that couldn't happen for me. But you have to understand, and you have to remember, this happened for me more than 25 years after my trauma. Even though I'd been living emotionally dead and dissociated and depersonalized for over 2 decades. And I think that's really important to call out, because we have a tendency to think, oh, it can't happen for me because I've been this way for so long. My very first client, I was total newbie in this profession, and my very first client was in her 50s. She'd had PTSD since she was 2. I didn't know it was possible. I just said, look, I'm trained in these alternative modalities. They saved my life. Let's see what they do for yours. And she healed. And that was like back in 2009. And I still get email from her telling me how amazing her life is now, almost monthly. And so that was, after over 50 years of struggling with symptoms and massive multiple trauma. And so the brain, as we know, is very good at neurogenesis. So the potential to heal is there for all of us until our very last breath. The brain is an organism designed for change. So the change of recovery, in some way, I believe, is always there. I've worked with people who have been traumatized as little kids, and then developmentally you don't grow exactly the way everybody else would have, because you're already dealing with so much stress. But the amount of healing that I see even developmentally changed people achieve would blow your head off just at the beauty of it. So it's important to remember that your brain wants to do what you want. And so I think the number one thing that got me where I wanted to go, and that can get other people there through the toughest times, and figuring out like Where's my joy? I don't feel it. I don't know what I'm doing. The number one thing is desire. When you desire your recovery more than you fear your past, or when you desire your future more than you fear your past, you can go a very, very, very long way and create some really startling results.
Very good. So based on your experience now, what advice would you give to parents who have children who may have gone through a traumatic event? So obviously the idea would be to break the cycle or stop it before, you know, don't have to wait 30 years to kind of recover. We can kind of like address it early on and help them heal early on, then they can go on and not kind of like be living, not their full life, or having maladaptive kind of like behaviors or coping strategies.
That's such a great question, Damien. I wish more people talked about that. I wrote about this in my first book, because my mom knew enough to know that what had happened to me was going to cause severe psychological damage, but she didn't know anything about trauma. And she before I left the hospital, she made me see a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist came to my room, and I couldn't talk about it. So I literally just sat, there's up in the corner of every hospital room is a TV. And I remember I watched Tom and Jerry cartoons for the 45 minutes that this woman sat silently by my bed because I refused to engage with her. And I wrote in my first book about, what would have happened to me? How different could my life have been? And this is the answer that I have to your question. If she had talked to me instead, if she had spent those 45 minutes normalizing my experience and educating me about the impact that it potentially could have, and encouraging me to speak up if I had any of these symptoms in the future, if she had told me, you might end up feeling anxious, I had a recurring nightmare I never told anybody about, but it was terrifying. It eventually, I only slept 1 to 2 hours a night because I was afraid to fall asleep. I mean, it was ridiculous. I never told anybody. So I think if parents would sit kids down and educate them about trauma, and that this has zero to do with you, this is like a normal process of how the brain tries to understand what happened to you. And if we were to normalize it for people and educate them so that they understood this is not your fault. You are separate from whatever the fallout is, and your true self is going to still remain underneath the junk of whatever trauma lands on you. Oh, Damien, I think this would be a different world. There was a great, I haven't been able to find it, but there was a great experiment done after 9/11. I interviewed one of the therapists that was involved in the experiment, and he explained to me that they took a group of people, a group of survivors of 9/11, and they split them into two groups. One group got individual talk therapy. Each person got a therapist. The other group stayed as a group, and they had trauma education as a group. Which group, A or B, ended up with PTSD? That's right. That's right. Everyone in their little siloed therapeutic environment talking about what happened to them, they had a higher prevalence of PTSD than the group. You had community, you had education, you had normalization. What if all parents were taught to do that? So that's what I would tell parents: normalize it, educate, make it be something that's separate from who the person is, so they always stay away from the impulse to blame themselves, which causes shame, and then you hide, and then you go 3 decades and lose a third of your life to something that was totally healable if you just had the right process and understanding and knowledge.
Very true. So what advice would you give to anyone who may suspect that they did go through some events in their life that may have had an impact on them, they're noticing, or in reflection, I think when we get to our 40s and 50s, we tend to be a little bit more reflective. We tend to kind of like look at ourselves and ask hard questions because we realizing that, time is getting short. And then as far as we don't, as youth, we assume that life is endless and that we have like multiple years ahead. But as we get older, we realize that things are getting to the pointy end. And if we really want to kind of like have the kind of life we want, we start asking questions. Am I really enjoying life? Is my life the way it could be? Is there a better way of living life? And, so what advice would you give to someone who's beginning to realize that perhaps certain things have impacted them and they are not, where they would want to be? So what advice would you give to them?
Right. So I would say, I'm not a big proponent of endless talk therapy, but I am a big proponent of starting in talk therapy. I would say get to a trauma-informed specialist, a trauma-informed therapist, because I feel like it's very important, or I believe I've seen how important it is, even in my own process, to be able to start reclaiming control starts with being able to put language to what you're feeling and to organize your story. Because a part of what goes on in your head is your story is fragments. Trauma fragments who you are, it shatters your sense of self. And then all these fragments just sort of float around. Well, the first thing you have to do is create a story and a flow of story and your ability to tell your story, not necessarily publicly like I do, but just with you and one other person, or just you to yourself. Like, let's just say you can't afford it. I would say you still have to start with being able to organize your story. And once you do that, you start to reclaim control of the thing that's been controlling you, because there's power in language and there's power in story. Then you need to start figuring out, am I telling myself the right story? And you need to be able to soothe the wound, shed the story, and shift the meaning. I have a 3-phase approach to trauma recovery, and that's the second phase. That's the change work that needs to be done. Soothe the wound, shed the story, shift the meaning. Because once you're able to start doing that, you've got a foundation then for moving ultimately into whatever healing modality resonates with you, whether it's somatic, or it's energy work, or it's unconscious work. Find the modalities that resonate with you so you can get down to the deeper levels that need to be excavated. But I think everything begins with normalization and education, and a trauma-informed therapist is the best place to do that.
Awesome. So what message of hope would you like to leave the audience with, those who are suffering at this particular point of time, regardless if it's trauma, PTSD, or some other mental illness? What is the message of hope you would like to leave them with?
You have enormous healing potential. The goal is learning to access it. And to do that, you have to dig deep. And I think that the most important message is to, number one, recognize that you have that potential. And just because you haven't accessed it up until today is meaningless. You just haven't been ready, or you haven't committed, or you haven't taken responsibility, or you haven't found the right modality, or you haven't found the right guide. Whatever it is, that healing potential lives in you always. And so the message would be, go after it. Figure out how to access it. Figure out how deep inside yourself you have to go to be able to access that part of you that is the reason you're listening to this conversation. You are here in this moment because of that part of you that wants to heal. Engage it, make it bigger, allow it to come out, foster it. I could keep going. I get super passionate about this, Damien. Sorry, that's the message. You have enormous healing potential. All you have to
Awesome.
do is learn how to access it.
Awesome. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for being so vulnerable and willing to share your story. I'm sure it's resonated with a lot of people. You kind of like certainly helped them understand that there is no shame in what they've experienced, also that they should feel empowered, that there is a road to healing. So certainly have hope. So for anyone interested in learning more about yourself and the work you do, how can they find you online?
Oh, so easily. Just pop by mytraumacoach.com, or you can just Google Michelle Rosenthal trauma, Michelle with one L. And on my website, I have a free download. It's an MP3 designed to train your brain for peace and calm. And all the feedback that I get is that it helps people sleep. It helps them re-regulate. It helps them find a place of peace. So I'm happy to share that with anybody who wants it, because we're all in this together. Ultimately, we don't heal in isolation. We heal in community. So there's a community at mytraumacoach.com. Come by, come join us.
Awesome. So one more time, thank you so much for being willing to share your Happy Minds story.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure to engage with your happy mind, Damien, and create just one more link in the chain of what healing is and what it means and how we all get there together. We get there together.
Awesome. Well, one more time, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.